Makes Me Wanna Holler by Nathan McCall. Chapter 35, Babylon. In 1984, my bosses assigned me to help cover City Hall. At the time, I knew nothing about politics except the little I picked up working at my first newspaper. But I couldn't turn down the chance to take a plum beat such as City Hall. Besides, for me there were compelling reasons to be interested in politics. Andrew Young was the mayor of Atlanta and was plugged into the national political arena. He and other prominent black Atlantans were figuring into that year's presidential campaign, which included Jesse Jackson. I actually got excited and felt optimistic. With campaigns and elections involving more blacks came the hope that maybe we could gain a measure of control over our destinies and get the system to work for us for a change. I was curious to see close up just how much we benefited from having blacks involved in politics. I saw in Atlanta that we benefited in the sense that black political leaders could use the city government as a vehicle to hire other minorities and to ensure that black businesses got a fair share of the city contract dollars. But beyond that, there was only so much they could do to help the masses of black folks. There were only so many jobs the city government could provide. To employ more people, the city needed help from private industry, which was composed primarily of white business people. That's where the major breakdowns occurred. Covering City Hall, I saw how white-run businesses, such as banks, actually undermined development in black communities. One year, a reporter at our newspaper won a Pulitzer Prize for a series of stories he did on redlining in the Atlanta area. His research showed that white banks turned down home improvement and mortgage loans for blacks at a much higher rate than they turned down loan applications for whites with less income. Here was the real kicker. The research showed that the loan default rate among whites was much higher than the default rate for blacks. Yet whites were able to get bank loans much easier than blacks. The bottom line was, white bankers relied on their racist assumptions about black people to guide their judgment. As a result, blacks were often denied loans that would have helped them improve their neighborhoods, raise property values, and improve their quality of life. Learning that kind of stuff pissed me off. It countered the notion, often repeated among handkerchief-head assimilationist blacks, that racism is just a harmless attitude that should be ignored. It's an attitude, true, but one that translates into policies that make life unnecessarily hard for blacks. I was also curious on the City Hall beat to see how African Americans handled power. During the Civil Rights Movement, before blacks began gaining political offices in substantial numbers, we often stood on the outside of the political arena and proclaimed that we could be more righteous leaders than the whites did inside the system. I wonder if that was true. I discovered over time that although it is good to have blacks in office, in some respects, black politicians are no different than whites. For politicians, black or white, politics is a game. It's all the better if the public benefits, but most of the time it's about winning. Winning re-election, or winning a debate, or getting one up on an opponent in some political maneuver. One day, after watching a particularly petty squabble among black Atlanta City Council members, I complained to one councilman I had gotten to know pretty well. What's wrong with these folks, man? I thought they had a stronger sense of purpose than that. The councilman, Bill Campbell, smiled and said something I'll never forget. Nathan, there are two things you never want to see being made: laws and sausage. I'd never seen sausage made, but the process of lawmaking was sometimes nauseating. It was especially interesting during my 4 years covering City Hall to watch Mayor Andrew Young. He is a fascinating man with a brilliant sense of world politics. Talking with him about his civil rights experiences was like taking a stroll through history. Andy, as we called him, was very approachable and down to earth. He'd take time to chat, even when his schedule was tight, and he was generous to a fault. He even took time out once to take pictures with my brother Billy and his family when they came to Atlanta to visit me. It was nothing for Andy to appear at a press conference with Coretta Scott King as a favor to her and the King family. When she summoned the press, we reporters either didn't show up or we left early because everyone knew that you rarely got useful information from Coretta Scott King. I covered a couple of press conferences where she didn't even allow reporters to ask questions. But when Young lent his presence, gobs of reporters showed up and stayed until the press conference was over. Although I liked Andy personally, I cared less for his political style. He served the same role in politics that he had in the civil rights movement. He was a peacemaker, a conciliator. Unlike Hosea Williams, who would loud talk and browbeat you, when Andy first ran for office to succeed Maynard Jackson, white business leaders put up a white candidate against him. He was elected largely on the black vote, but in office, he bent over backward to work with the very whites who'd opposed him. He cooperated royally with the Chamber of Commerce to help attract business investments and persuade corporations to relocate to Atlanta. There was no greater salesman of Atlanta than Andrew Young. He traveled the world pitching Atlanta as a haven of racial harmony, tossing around slogans that the Chamber of Commerce created to promote the city. Sometimes they called it the International City or the city too busy to hate. The problem with promoting such grand untruths is that by failing to acknowledge racial problems, one makes no headway in overcoming them. Atlanta was no more international than Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Everything was seen in terms of black and white, and it certainly wasn't a city too busy to hate. Whites didn't want to share contract dollars with blacks. They didn't want blacks living near them on the north side, and they resented the loss of political clout and at times did everything they could to undermine black leadership. During his 2 terms, from 1982 to 1990, Andy's popularity declined a lot with local blacks, who felt he wasn't assertive enough in pressing black communities' agendas. They wanted him to do like Maynard Jackson had done, tell racist white folks where they could get off. But there was a method to Andy Young's approach. I think he labored under the assumption that if you proclaimed often enough that there was racial harmony, white people would catch on and begin working to help create some harmony. It was an extension of the civil rights strategy to appeal to the conscience of white America. What it showed me was that Andy hadn't yet accepted a harsh reality about white America. When it comes to blacks, whites have no conscience. Whites don't bend unless forced to bend. They don't give 1 inch if they don't have to. The only time I saw Andy really get fighting mad was during the 1984 presidential campaign. He was supporting Walter Mondale, but Mondale's campaign was falling apart. At the Atlanta convention of the National Association of Black Journalists, Andy said Mondale's campaign was being ruined by smart-ass white boys who didn't really know what they were doing. I understood his frustration. Here he was, politically seasoned and world-renowned, and young white boys who didn't know diddly were running the presidential campaign, screwing it up, and ignoring advice and input from Andy and others. Practically every working black person in America could relate to that. It was a classic example of white male arrogance. In the 1980s, something ugly filtered down from the national leadership that made me hone in even more on politics. Open hostility toward blacks came back in vogue. Bigots now had the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, on their side. Six-Gun Ron's single phrase, welfare queens, had become white America's rallying cry, the catch-all explanation for every problem the country faced. To hear some whites tell it, shiftless, unpatriotic black people and their reliance on government assistance was breaking the U.S. Treasury. Unqualified blacks were taking money and jobs that should go to honest, hard-working whites. In short, black people were single-handedly bringing down the country. Yet, with Reagan's blessing, Big-time white corporations plundered the country, acquiring other companies in hostile takeovers and firing employees wholesale without a thought. Multinational corporations exported jobs to foreign countries for cheap labor. Corporate presidents got fat benefit packages while their employees were laid off or given salary cuts. These were the real anti-patriots, and nobody got hostile toward them. But some white Americans would get so angry they couldn't see straight whenever they heard about some black welfare mother who might have gotten more food stamps one month than she was entitled to. That kind of acerbity kept me hot under the collar. I was mad at Reagan for using black people as scapegoats for the insanity he helped inspire, and mad at white Americans who demonstrated every day how naive, gullible, and selfish they are. I walked around furious all the time. So mad sometimes I had to actually calm myself. I kept hoping the rest of black America would see what I saw and get mad like me. Mad enough to do something about it, to take to the streets, cast out on our own, do anything other than pray and tolerate the shit being slung at us. Jesse Jackson's campaign brought some relief. I think his run for president brought a mild ray of hope to millions of African Americans fed up with the status quo. His chances of winning were slim to none, but it felt good having somebody who represented a real alternative to the white bread that was running things. I watched the campaigns closely and held ongoing telephone debates with Jim, my Southampton mentor. I felt that the campaign showed great promise for blacks, and he felt that focusing on politics was a waste of time. We can't look to politics for our salvation, brother man, because white folks control the rules of the game, he said. I argued, they can't stop somebody who learns to play the game as well as them. Jesse has his shortcomings, but he can play the game. We both watched as the campaigns unfolded and telephoned each other when there were developments that bolstered our opposing positions. Over time, I saw what Jim meant. The Democratic Party treated Jesse more like an agitator, an outsider, than a qualified candidate. I saw that some of the questions raised in the media about Jesse didn't seem to apply to other candidates. Is he qualified? Would his ego get in the way? The popular question that bothered me most was, what does Jesse want? The implication was that he couldn't possibly want to be president of the United States. He was a black man. Watching the political developments, I couldn't help but think of my high school graduation when I told a yearbook staffer that I wanted to be the first black U.S. president. I knew then that that bullshit about equal opportunity wasn't true. Here we are, 11 years later, and my assessment was still right. When I told Jim that he won the argument, he said, "See what I mean? It doesn't really matter much that Jesse has learned to play the game. When confronted with a black person who plays the game as well as them, white folks simply change the rules." Andy and other black political leaders in the city tried to keep up with what was going on at the Journal-Constitution, particularly as it related to blacks. During the time when black reporters were having meetings with management to discuss our complaints, he called me into his office. "So what's going on with black folks at the paper? Is it something that we can help with?" It warmed me inside to hear that kind of concern. Black leaders in my hometown would never have been that plugged in. Part of me wanted to spill it all, tell him how blacks were simply tolerated at the paper and left out in important news decisions being made by smart-ass white boys who knew nothing about the people they covered in this largely black city. I knew he had the power to mobilize Atlanta's black communities in a big way. The idealist in me wanted to reach out to say, "Let's join forces, Andy, and take them on. We'll start our own black paper and do our own thing if we have to." But there were other concerns. For good reason, journalists are trained not to trust or get too chummy with politicians, black or white. They'll buddy up to you to the point where eventually you can't write about them objectively when the time calls for it. I didn't think Andy was that devious, but I wasn't sure. I hated being torn like that. My first allegiance was to black folks, but politicians' allegiances is to politics. Andy was compassionate, but he was also an astute politician. In the end, I followed my instincts, which told me to watch what I say. I gave Andy a brief review of what was going on, but never spilled my heart the way I really wanted to. As a lot of the white folks at the paper saw it, the real competition in the newsroom was between white women and white men. Both sides seemed quietly annoyed that blacks wanted in. They weren't openly vicious about it. They just didn't think black journalists were qualified to compete on their level. In subtle ways, management promoted the notion that every black who came through the newsroom door was an affirmative action hire given a job that he wasn't really qualified for. A white reporter told me once that when she asked for a raise, a manager told her she couldn't have one because they had to give raises to black reporters on staff. You know, affirmative action. The manager failed to explain to her that blacks weren't being paid on par with white reporters. But it seemed none of the whites, male or female, wanted us competing on an even keel with them, especially not us black men. On many levels, they were scared of us. I guess they saw black men's aggression on basketball courts and on street corners, and they knew what would happen if we ever got hip to the establishment game and transferred that aggression into their arena. They feared they wouldn't stand a chance if they had to compete head-on with an even keel with us. So they had to give themselves an edge. They put shit in the game. With the help of management, they floated whispering campaigns. You know those black reporters can't write so well. They're okay, but they're not aggressive enough as reporters. They can't handle complicated stories. That was their unspoken justification for not giving blacks good assignments. And it was the same approach taken during slavery. An act of cruelty was made to appear to be a gesture of compassion. Why free slaves if they're too dumb to fend for themselves? Why give black reporters plum beats and complex assignments if they can't handle them? Every black journalist feels those patronizing airs from whites and hears those myths whispered, almost sympathetically, 1,000,000 times in his career. So every black reporter who comes into the newsroom comes in on guard, carrying the burden of proving himself against such painful indictments, constantly aware that the slightest error in grammar, sentence structure, or story construction will be cited as undeniable proof of what white folks have always suspected. It's a heavy burden. Success in journalism is tied directly to a writer's psychological state. You need to be relaxed to write well. But blacks at the Journal-Constitution never had that comfort. They were too busy battling the myths. It worked a number on everybody, if in no other way than require a huge expenditure of energy fighting the stereotypes. Even if we won, we lost. Because of the myths, I could never seem to settle down and relax and write with flair the way I knew I could under normal circumstances. Every time I sat down to a computer to type a story, all the stereotypes shot through my head and I had to battle to push them out. They say we can't write well. They say we can't write fast. They say... Sometimes I'd have to take deep breaths and give myself pep talks to chase the myths away so that I could do my work. But it's hard to set them completely aside. You can't forget. You know you can't slip, or your white bosses will say, "See, we gave him a chance, but he was incompetent." And if you slip, it can break you. I saw it happen to a reporter named Cassandra, who started at the paper about a year after I got there. She started on the night shift, general assignment. One day, she made a mistake in the story that required the paper to print a correction. Then Brenda Mooney, who ran the city desk, and the editor who supervised Cassandra made a big fuss about it. And after that, Cassandra's editor stopped giving her good assignments. She was given only lightweight stories, like weather reports. Sitting just a few seats away, I could see Cassandra begin to doubt herself. Every time she sat down at her computer to write, I saw her hands trembling on the keyboard and her eyes focused so intently on the screen that it looked like she was about to crack. Then Cassandra made another mistake in the story. I understood why. I understood that you can get so nervous about making a mistake, so tense about it, that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Cassandra's editor decided to get rid of her. I never heard the editor say it, but I saw in the way she treated Cassandra. She put the freeze on her, giving her fewer and fewer story assignments. Some evenings, Cassandra would sit at her desk all day and not get a single assignment. I saw editors walk past her and get reporters who were busy on one story to work on another one when Cassandra could have done it. Eventually, Cassandra's self-confidence fell so far she couldn't recover. She was a nervous wreck, fighting the myths and verifying them at the same time. Eventually, she gave up. She left the paper and took a job at some lesser publication in a larger city. I don't think she ever recovered from that experience. When I thought about what they did to Cassandra, I realized that it was a variation of the same thing that happened to Tootie, the guy my homeboys ran the train on in prison. Even though Tootie was a man, they treated him like a woman until they psyched him into believing he just might be more of a woman than he realized. Even though Cassandra was equal to that editor and every other white person in the newsroom, she was treated like an inferior so consistently that she accepted it and gave in, the same way Tootie eventually gave in to being treated like a woman. What made it so bad was that Cassandra was a small-time schmoozer. Unlike me, she went out drinking with white folks in the office, including the two women who eventually cut her throat. She went biking with them. She trusted them, and they cut her down without batting an eye. Whenever somebody asked what happened to Cassandra, they ran for cover and spoke in the coded way that some whites speak when talking about blacks. Well, you know, she has some problems. I felt sorry for Cassandra. I pitied a lot of the blacks I saw, for good reason. They came into the system believing the promise that if you make sure you're qualified, and if you assimilate and work twice as hard as white people, you can be anything you want to be. But the promise wasn't kept. Even though some blacks did everything, even changed their appearance and contort their personalities to try to blend. The most difficult loss for me was Michael, a guy in his mid-20s who wrote for the paper's business section. His editor said he wasn't happy with Michael's work. I could tell Michael's confidence was crushed in much the same way Cassandra's confidence had been destroyed. He was ready to give up. I told him, "Nah, man, you can't do that." By then, I heard that story many times, especially from the business section, where the editor, who was white, seemed insecure about the fact that several black reporters working under him held master's degrees from the nation's top schools. Michael had earned an undergraduate degree in journalism from the University of Pennsylvania and an MBA from Wharton. On top of that, he was one of the brightest young brothers I had ever seen. He was a Paul Robeson type, a cat whose intellectual interests were so broad that it blew my mind. If he had been a white boy with that kind of promise, they'd have put him on the management track from day one. Instead, Michael's editor had been hounding him to quit. During an evaluation, he cited a couple of mistakes Michael had made in some stories over a few years. Michael, another black reporter named Susan Howard, and I stayed in the newsroom late one night and made computer printouts of all the corrections printed as a result of mistakes made by white business reporters. What we found was no surprise. Some reporters had required numerous corrections in a single year, more than Michael had in his entire stay at the paper. Armed with that information, We had Michael prepare a formal, written response to the business editor, refuting all allegations. The editor backed off, but he didn't let up completely. He found other ways to hound Michael until my man grew weary of fighting. Michael got special approval to take an extended leave, which the editor eagerly granted, and went off to Africa for a summer. He never came back to the paper. After we lost Michael, I grew even more discouraged about the prospect of trying to survive in the white mainstream. Our problem at the Journal-Constitution was the same problem blacks face everywhere. No matter how we tried to fit in and help improve the system, we couldn't win for losing. In a strange way, it was a comfort knowing that I wasn't the only brother catching flack on my job. Friends. Other folks I knew around the city were also catching serious hell. One of them was my buddy Haroon, whom I met at Norfolk State. Haroon worked for United Way, where employees were encouraged to wear conservative business clothes. Tall, slender, and brown-skinned, Haroon had a mustache and a thick goatee. He wore the required business suits, but added an African flair to his dress. He'd drape a strip of kente cloth over his shoulder or slap a colorful kufi onto his head. Haroon's supervisor, a nervous black guy, constantly rolled his back about his style of dress and worried that it might frighten or offend some of their best white clients. My supervisor said I make white folks feel uncomfortable, Haroon told me. I asked him, how am I going to change my appearance to please these white folks? That's impossible. White folks are scared of black men, period. They don't want to have to look at our asses. White folks get uncomfortable if brothers are too tall, too short, too light, too dark, too quiet, too loud, too anything. You just can't please them motherfuckers no way you try. I sensed that Haroon's problems ran deeper than white folks' fears, that most of all his garb bothered his supervisor. Many evenings, we get together at his place or mine, play chess and talk about the establishment and how crazy it was. To lighten the mood, we joned each other about what we were going through. I called the white man on his job Mr. Charlie, and he called white folks where I worked Mr. Gilmore, which he pronounced Mr. Gilmore. Mr. Gilmore ain't gonna let you write what you want to write. Or, you better be thankful to Mr. Gilmore for being good to you. And we laughed until our sides ached, even though we were both hurting inside. Whenever we got together, he always had to tell about his handkerchief head supervisor who thought Haroon was an embarrassment to other blacks on the job. Man, this cat is whiter than white folks, he'd say. You should see him checking me out every day when I come into his office. I went to work the other day wearing a bow tie. White cats wear bow ties all the time, and it's no big deal. But when I walk in there, I get all these smart-ass comments from him about me looking like a militant Muslim. Sometimes, Haroon got deeply depressed and talked longingly about getting out the system. He talked about that like I used to talk about being free from prison. But he couldn't take off or leave or lash out at his boss like he wanted. He had responsibilities. He was married and had 2 children. He always had the sense that he could never get to who he really was because he was always under pressure to be somebody else. Haroon had the soul of an artist. He had never taken formal art lessons, yet he could paint like a master. He had never taken music lessons, yet he learned African drumming. I always had that same feeling of being restricted by forces beyond my reach and never knowing what I could really be and do. I feared that the longer I stayed in the system, the further I would get away from who I really was. Haroon told to me a whole new subculture in Atlanta that I hadn't been exposed to much before. He lived in the West End, a trendy area on the black side of town. There were a lot of Muslims, reefer-smoking Rastas, and old-head revolutionaries there. They all shared a distaste for the system and a desire to create alternative lifestyles more suitable to them. We go to one of their cribs and they be sitting around smoking cigar-sized spliffs, listening to music, and rapping about the evils of Babylon, the white man's depraved civilization. They call white folks bald heads and culture vultures because, they said, whites devalue blacks to our faces while at the same time trying to steal and capitalize off our creativity in everything. Dance, music, art, style, inventions, etc. I liked that bunch of folks more than any other I cut into. They were streetwise yet well-read, rough-hewn but politically astute. Many of those cats made their yearly pilgrimage to Africa and talked of their yearning to make it their home. I laughed to myself about the fact that while most other black people were bursting their butts to get into the system, those folks were scrambling to get out. A lot of them had figured out ways to survive outside the system and to keep from working for the white man. Some worked as street vendors, selling incense on corners downtown. Others sold fruit and t-shirts and hustled in various ways. Some even sold reefer to keep afloat. They bartered and worked in neighborhood co-op to keep food costs down and ran their own schools to teach their children. One of the guys I met in the West End was called Juju, a jeweler who was known all along the East Coast as one of the finest in his profession. I don't know what happened in life to make Juju so bitter, but he refused to even talk to white people. He let his wife do any negotiations that required interaction with whites. There were many whites trying to do business with Juju. A prominent white-owned store chain offered him a lucrative contract to make jewelry exclusively for its stores nationwide, but he turned it down because it required so much involvement with the bald heads. He could have made a lot of money if he'd been willing to venture into the white world, but he said money was less important to him than his sanity. I once knocked guys like that who wouldn't deal in the system. I thought they were copping out because they were scared to compete toe-to-toe with the white man. But after working in Atlanta, I began to understand why brothers opted for alternative hustles rather than working 9 to 5. They knew Babylon meant them no good. They understood that they couldn't win in the system without giving up a lot of themselves. Haroon also turned me on to reggae music. I had heard it in passing, but not listened closely to it until one night when we were playing chess at his place. I fell in love with reggae. Its spiritual lyrics and political messages were in tune with how I felt about being a black man in this country. Some days, when work was really getting to me, I'd leave the office on my lunch hour, go home, and put on some serious Bob Marley. I'd crank up the volume loud and try to blast all that whiteness out my head. Then I'd return to work, pumped up and able to make it through the rest of the day. Things eventually got better or worse for Haroon, depending on how you look at it. He grew dreadlocks and, as might have been expected, his supervisor tried to drive him off the job. Finally, when he and his wife separated, he packed up and left for Oakland, California to try to develop his skills as an artist. Before he left, I bought one of his paintings, which reflected his wish to be liberated from Babylon. I still have it today. It's a huge painting of a black man with long, flowing, colorful dreadlocks, jogging along a deserted, sun-swept beach, free. In the background, there are birds flying in the shadow of a bright red setting sun, inscribed with the faint outline of the continent of Africa. Okay, that brings us to the end of chapter 35, Babylon. And you know, I'm glad he chose to talk about politics in this chapter. Recently, Killer Mike, I think he won quite a few Grammys for his last album. But in one of his interviews I saw him in early last year, he said that slogan that Atlanta was a city too busy to hate. And when he said it then, I thought to myself, well, that sounds like bullshit. Because racism, white supremacy, that doesn't have a too busy button to hate. So when I saw him write this in this book, like that was a term coined by Andrew Young, I was like, oh, okay. So this is something that they're trying to promote, hoping that it will become true. You got to have a better understanding of how white supremacy works so that you can know that that idea of a city too busy to hate, that's not true. There's plenty enough time to hate for white supremacy. And I also want to point out that I'm of the belief, or hell, I know, this is what I know for myself, but politics isn't the answer when it comes to fixing our situation. Because they control politics in a sense. That's like some long-term corruption. And I know the people that they put in front of us are just puppets. You know, you look at your congressmen and your senators and even your president. You know, all these people answer to someone that we don't see. There is a term called the shadow government. These are people who rule from the shadows. And I like to compare it to Star Wars. You know, when you first see Star Wars, the very first one that came out, you see Darth Vader, and you think he's the ultimate bad guy. And it's not till the third movie that you see the Emperor, the guy that Darth Vader answers to. And I really do believe that's how it works with our system. That the people who really rule the world, they're off in the shadows somewhere. You don't see what they're doing. The people they put out in front of you, they're put out there to be the scapegoats. You get mad and yell and fuss at them. Meanwhile, the people who really affect change, you don't never see them on television or in the media. Even this idea of using another man's monetary system to free yourself. Now, there's nothing federal about the Federal Reserve. You don't vote for any of the members on there. You don't control what they do. Hell, they lend the money to the United States, and the United States has to pay that back at interest. So how do you get out of debt? When the people printing your money give it to you, or they lend it to you, you have to pay it back with interest. That's a scam. So that's something that they give us to give us this idea of hope. Remember when Barack Obama got elected, it was change you can believe in and hope. That was his big thing. But I often quote Frank Herbert from his book Dune, and he said, one of the characters in the book said, hope clouds observation. You know, you being hopeful will stop you from seeing things for what they truly are, and you see them for what you want them to be. So don't let them play you with hope. That idea of politics saving us, yeah, that's a pipe dream. But anyway, you guys let me know what you think, and I'll see y'all in the next chapter. Peace. And one more thing before I forget, thank you guys for listening in. The channel has been growing. You guys have been enjoying this story, and I've been enjoying bringing it to you. So thank you for listening. Share this with somebody that you think could benefit from listening to this story. I think there are a lot of black men and black women, hell, even some white people who could benefit from hearing Nathan McCall's story, because it does give a glimpse into our minds. Another thing of note that I haven't said before, it's interesting that Nathan McCall and my father are the same age. So just listening to his story and things that he was experiencing in high school makes me, I'll go back and ask my dad questions about how he was feeling, and when, question him about, what things were going on in the city of Savannah, Georgia when he was coming up. But anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you check out my ebook. I'll leave a description. Well, excuse me, not a description. I'll leave a link for that to my ebook, Free Your Mind to Have Peace of Mind. And I'll see you guys in the next chapter. All right, peace.